me in the Slack channel, let me know if you see it.
MK is woman. Woohoo! Welcome, MK.
All right, we are seconds away. All right, that is now live streaming to YouTube. Turn the volume down, make sure we don't get any double feedback here. Kathy, can you see that in YouTube? Cool, we're live on YouTube.
Woohoo! Hey, YouTube.
All right. Everybody's getting an email. This is a pro tip for anybody doing some marketing for your courses and whatnot. When you live streaming, video was a thing, now live streaming is a thing. So, and video is still a thing, but live streaming is a great way to kind of get things out there, and if you want to rank higher in the algorithm. But let's go ahead and officially kick this off. I'm going to hit record, and for our replay, so I'm recording. All right, so welcome everybody to this webinar on how to get more students, grow your audience, and gain authority through podcast guesting. I've got a really special guest today. Her name is Nicole Holland. Nicole, thank you for coming on the webinar.
Thank you for having me, Chris. I'm stoked to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. And Nicole is a really brilliant mind in terms of leveraging podcasts and thinking about it differently as a marketing channel, and really taking a structured approach to growing your audience and really recognizing the true power of leveraging other people's audiences in a way that adds value all the way around, and also doing it in a very professional and systematized way. So as course creators, we often talk about the 4 legs of the stool that you need to be successful. One thing you need is you need your expertise. The other thing you need to be is a community builder. You need to be an instructional designer and be able to package your courses. And then you need to be a technology implementer. It's very rare that one person can hold all those different skill sets. And in terms of building community, podcasting is a really powerful way to do that. And it may feel like podcasting is it's too late to get in the game. But in my opinion, podcasting is very much in the early days, building relationships with other podcasting and not even necessarily thinking about starting your own podcast. There's different ways to leverage that medium, and that's what we're going to get into today. And Nicole has a lot of wisdom and experience in this field, and a lot of I hope you take out your pen and paper, and when those light bulb moments come, just write these ideas down, because I get asked all the time. The place where Lifter LMS lives is we live in the technology part of the stack that course creators need to be successful. But you can have the best content in the world and the best technology in the world, but if you're not building community or doing some marketing, you have a real problem. And I get asked all the time for marketing advice, or how do I build my email list, how to get more students in my course. And this webinar with Nicole is a way to help you latch on and find a strategy that can work, that can get like really exponential returns if you do it correctly. And especially if you let that compounding effect play out over time, of committing to using podcast guesting as a way to grow your audience and gain traction in the marketplace. So if you're new to Zoom, there's a chat away. If you're just dropping in, let us know where you're from, say hello. And there's also a Q&A feature here on the webinar. So if you have a question that you want answered, go ahead and drop that in the Q&A, and we'll get to those. And also at the very end of this webinar, we'll also, if you want to raise your hand, there's like a raise your hand feature. We can bring you into the webinar and hear your voice and have a conversation around a certain topic that you're asking about. So say hello in the chat, ask questions, and if you want to kind of go live at the end of this webinar and have an exchange with us, we'd love to do that too. So, but again, I want to thank Nicole. Thank you for coming on the show. Check out Nicole's podcast. It's called Get Guest Ready. And she has other podcasts as well, but that one's the most relevant to the show. But Nicole, can you tell us a little bit about, like, what is this all about? What are we talking about today in terms of leveraging this amazing tool of podcasting, and what's your story? Like, how did you get into all this?
I should have probably taken the sip while you were talking before, but thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody who is here with us live, and to everybody who's watching the replay as well. Calvin, Jeff, John, Joseph, Michelle, MK, Sean, and Steve, and everybody that's joining us. I just want to, first of all, say thank you for taking your time out of your day. I know you guys are busy. I mean, you're experts, you're course creators, you got stuff going on. So thanks for taking time out. I definitely want to give you as much value as I possibly can. So I don't want to go too much into about me. I will say though that I quit my job not very long ago, just over 2 years ago, as a correctional officer. I had no presence online. I knew nobody who had any idea who I was. And in a very short period of time, I've been able to rise very quickly in, perceived authority, and people seeing me as a thought leader and an expert, and having a lot of amazing friends like Chris and people who I have admired for a long time, like on speed dial. And this has happened in large part because of podcast guesting and because of building relationships with people through interviewing. And also clients, like the clients that I work with, they get to know me either through word of mouth. So where somebody like Chris says, hey, this woman knows what she's talking about, let me introduce you to some people like course creators who may need your services. And then also just from podcasts and being on those shows and giving value, and then letting people know how they can follow up with me. So the top of the funnel being the lead magnet. I'm just going to throw this in there real quick because it's relevant. Whenever you are on a podcast, you always want to give a free gift. And so having a great lead magnet that leads people to a next step, you don't sell courses from podcasts, but you build relationships and you introduce yourself. It's cold traffic. It's a little bit warmer than cold traffic, but only lukewarm. You wouldn't take a shower in it. So it's just kind of like whatever you would send somebody from a Facebook ad. Think about that with podcast guesting. But I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Talking about podcasts, also, I just want to touch on Joseph's question. Thank you, Joseph. So to set the stage, so different people say podcasting and it means something different. So there are definitely video podcasts. What I refer to when I talk about podcast guesting essentially is anything that is on iTunes. Yes, people have podcasts that are not on iTunes, but if they're not in the iTunes directory, I don't really consider them viable sources generally for traffic, for traffic generation and building those relationships. So for all intents and purposes today here, when I talk about podcast guesting, I'm talking about audio publication on iTunes and the iTunes directory. Joseph asked if there's a difference between podcasting and webcasting or streaming like we're doing right now. And there is. However, the lines are blurring. So live streaming is live streaming. This is sort of a webinar. There's going to be a replay. We're recording. And also the okay, sorry, I'm distracted by like things popping up. I'm not good at multitasking. So yes, you can do videos on YouTube and stuff, but I think what's happening right now as we're speaking today in May of 2017, I think the trend is really going to live streaming. So that would be through YouTube, through Facebook, other platforms that are popping up as well, where you're having an interaction with people and they're watching it live and can communicate live. And with that, I think a lot of podcasters are broadcasting live as they're recording. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but the lines are blurred. But yeah, as we're talking about podcast guesting, I'm talking about content that's being repurposed, even if it's live streamed, onto an audio-based platform that is feeding into the iTunes directory.
That's awesome. And I'm going to post here in the chat right now. This is Nicole's podcast called Get Guests Ready. And I think it's really important to note, like you're talking about, the word podcasting is kind of confusing. And I'm a podcaster. I'm at like episode 137 or so with LMS Cast. And when I started, I knew what it was. It's kind of like a radio show on the internet. And I personally do video when I do it so that I can also repurpose that content on YouTube. But I kind of think of a podcast as episodic audio content primarily. Like when I go for a run or I'm in a long car ride by myself or a plane ride, podcasting, I couldn't even imagine using regular radio anymore.
Yeah. Because you want
So,
that on-demand content that you're in the mood for, right?
yeah, absolutely.
And you can't watch a video as you're driving or as you're running or as you're folding laundry. So that episodic audio content that and it's delivered through so many. I mean, yeah, you can just do the RSS feed, but there's so many different platforms that it can be delivered through, and that's the beauty of with podcast guesting and why that matters that they're on iTunes is because the reach. Right? The reach. So if somebody is just posting to their blog, let's say, because you can have a podcast on your blog, it's basically, an audio blog, right? You can have it on your own blog or website, but who's listening to it? You only have the reach that you have, and you've got to cultivate that audience. But then when you put it in a directory like iTunes or Google Play Music or Stitcher, iHeartRadio, then there's all these other people who have access to it without having to find your website because they're searching for content on a specific topic to listen to. And that's where they can find the podcast. So when you're going on as a guest, you want to be intentional about getting on shows that have that kind of reach, that are cultivating audiences. So the host or their team is actually, going out and finding new listeners, and they're doing marketing. And then you get to leverage that as a course creator when you go on as a guest.
Yeah, and just to the course creators out there, when you're trying to market and you've got all these other things going on, you're trying to get new students, you're trying to design your course, you're trying to build the website. There's limited bandwidth for marketing, and podcast guesting is one of those strategies that, like, if I was going to do the 80-20 and only pick one, that's what I would do. And it's all about leveraging other people's audience in that, but it's not like you're taking advantage of other people's audience. You're adding value by coming on that platform and giving away some kind of free information, free value. And, you're helping the platform owner get more content into their podcast, and ultimately taking care of the listener, adding value, making sure you're guesting on the right platforms that make sense for ultimately what it is you do and what you teach. It's just such a high leverage activity that for a while, I would say maybe 8 to 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, guest blogging was very popular, and it still is. But and blogging is not dead by any means. But podcasting, you can't read a blog post while you're on a run. You can't read a blog post while you do dishes, at least not very easily. It's hard to take it on the plane with you. So podcasting is like this superpower when it comes to just portable content. And I mean, I would say, like, honestly, a lot of the stuff I know about business and entrepreneurship and marketing, like listening to podcasts is my secret weapon for just staying current, learning new things, getting exposure to new ideas, and, finding trusted authorities where I might get exposed to new ideas and new people that I'm not aware of, that are in alignment with my values and what I'm trying to do. So it's such a cool strategy.
Definitely. And I want to say too, and I know we're kind of jumping around here, and I don't know if you had a structure in place. I'm sorry if we're jumping around too much, and you guys definitely let it be interactive and post in the chat. Like, again, if you have any questions or anything comes up that's not clear, because I'm like, oh, squirrel, right? And Chris and I are so used to talking and just collaborating and yapping that make sure you're a part of this conversation as well. Use the chat and the Q&A for that. I want to just mention one thing. So in terms of leveraging other people's podcasts, and in terms of in terms of using them or not using them because you're giving content, because you're giving value and all that, that's all fine and well, but that's where most people stop. And I just want to really dig into something that matters to me. Yeah, podcast hosts who have interview-based shows need guests, but they don't just need any guests, they need great guests. Or as time goes on, they will. It's going to be harder. It's already hard to get on a great show. And the longer that this goes on and the more podcasting grows, the harder and harder it's going to be to get on these quality shows. So you have to stand out from the rest beyond the value that you're giving, beyond the the entertainment, beyond the connection and all that. You want to do things to really make the host appreciate you. And for example, Chris, before we started recording, was saying, "Oh, I got your cards." And I don't know if you want to hold those up again, Chris, or not, but yeah, so that's just one. That was from me for being on my show, but you got some from my clients as well. So yeah, so this is something where Camila Gornia, she's one of my VIP clients, so I take care of all her bookings. And so she wrote that card. I sent it out though. I designed it and I sent it out. But by sending a physical card, you stand out. Calvin Corelli, yep. Another client, you stand out. And by sending a thank you email after you're interviewed, you stand out. This might sound like common sense, but it's not. People, you'd be surprised how few people actually send a thank you email after being interviewed. And when they're finished, sending a social media tweet or post or something to acknowledge and appreciate the podcast host is very, very rare. And it's very, very simple. And so while we have limited bandwidth, we definitely want to focus on 20 and not 80 in terms of marketing. By creating a comprehensive strategy and a system that gives you that, yes, okay, so before I pitch a host, this is what I have in place. Then when I pitch a host, this is what happens. And then when they say yes, this is what happens. And then after the interview, this is what happens. By creating a system that works for you, you can bang this stuff out super simple and create an experience for the podcast host where they could potentially say, "Hey, Joseph, I love what you're talking about. I love what you're teaching. How can I support you?" And then that's an opportunity for you then to say, "Actually, I've got this course. And if you're interested, I'd love to make you an affiliate. If you think you have an audience that would resonate with this, we can make you an affiliate. I can get you a banner or something for your website. I can reward you for sales." Or, "Hey, maybe MK has consulting going on." And so she can have the host say, "Yeah, this sounds great." And you can say, "Great. Well, if you know of anybody, I'd love to be introduced," and then you can pay commission if you want or whatever you want to do. But there's so many great things you can do when you stand out. When you're just an average guest, you don't get that ability. You don't get to go have lunch with people. You don't get to go hang out and become friends with people because you're just one of the crowd. But when you go above and beyond with those little things like appreciation and truly coming from a place of I want to serve and being open to opportunities and possibilities of collaboration, so many doors can open. I mean, that's how this happened, right? Like Chris and we've just developed a relationship, and he's invited me here because he thinks that what I have to offer is valuable to you and he values you. And so that connection piece is unreal. Chris was on my show. It just actually aired on Wednesday, yesterday. And during the interview, because I love what he's up to and I'm really excited about Lifter LMS, and I haven't had the time to really dig in, I just impulsively said, "Hey, I know you're going to be walking me through it, but could we invite my audience so that more people can come and learn about Lifter LMS?" And he said, "Of course." So now we're going to do a training for my audience where they get exposed to Lifter LMS. So how cool is that, right? You have that opportunity when you're a great guest, not a mediocre. So I want to just encourage people to really think about, when you're thinking about all the things that you can do, think about, how can I make it even better for the host? How can I make it better for the audience? and let yourself just reap the rewards of that rather than thinking, how can I make it better for myself?
That's really awesome. And I think that spirit of service is what it's all about. And one of the phrases that I like to use if I'm going to be a guest somewhere, I just want to provide results in advance of making any kind of offer or pitch per se. Like I want to give away a lot of free value. If I'm going to have the privilege of being on somebody else's stage, I want to do that. And if you're an expert and you have a course, it's not an opportunity to just come on and pitch. It's like, let's talk about the issues that you're an expert on and, it's problems people face, maybe help articulate problems that people are having better than, they realize. And just by the act of doing that, it helps crystallize you as someone they might want to pay attention to going forward.
Yeah. And I think you do need to offer that, not pitch, but like at the end, you definitely want to let people know how they can take a next step with you. And you don't want to be, again, selling them, buy my this or buy my that, but by, giving them some more value once the conversation stops on air. That's really important because you are in business too, right? You do
Totally.
At the end of the day, you need to make sure that the podcasts that you're getting on are going to be profitable. And this is a mistake I see a lot of people making when they're starting out and even into it, is they just think exposure, numbers, podcast. I'll go anywhere. Well, if that's part of your strategy, then that's fine, but be intentional about that and know what podcasts you want to be on, and only focus on those. Only focus on the ones where when your value. And I would encourage you to think of outside of the box, not just what your course is about, not just what you get paid for, but think about your ideal student and think of them from a holistic standpoint. So what are their needs? What are their fears? What are their goals? What podcasts would they be listening to? So once you figure out you have to know who your ideal student or client is, you find out what podcasts they are listening to, then you go listen to those podcasts, and you listen not necessarily because you're trying to listen to podcasts to learn. You're listening with the intention of asking yourself, would I like to have dinner with this person? This host, could I really get into a conversation, into a dialogue and answer their questions? Could I really answer the questions of their audience? Would they enjoy being with me? Would I enjoy being with them? And when you can find that show that is focused on topics that your ideal client is looking for answers to, you can connect with the host, you can connect with the audience and have fun. Well, that's really a recipe for success.
That's awesome. And just for everybody listening, Steve, Sean, MK, Joseph, Jeff, Ivan, Kathy, Calvin, let us know in the chat what industry you're in, like what topic are you in, so that maybe we can provide some hypothetical examples for what you're talking about. And how, like right now, Jeff is asking how does he find a podcast host related to his training topic? So what would you say to that?
Well, first of all, like when you're going to do a search, iTunes is your best bet. You want to start there because, again, it's the place where, like, yeah, you could use Google and stuff, but you may find things that aren't on iTunes. And at the end of the day, if you're looking for exposure, the podcasts need to be on iTunes, at least today, at least in May of 2017. I know SiriusXM is getting into the podcasting game. iHeartRadio just got in. So there's some very, very big players that are getting in. So that may change, but you want to make sure that you're searching in a directory where you're going to get a lot of exposure. Again, know your student, know what issues they're concerned with or what interests they have or what they're searching for, and then use it's a basic keyword search, right? You would just, at the upper right hand corner on the desktop of iTunes, there's a search bar and you can start searching for those keywords. Another thing you can do is take note of who is a leader in your industry that's come before you that people know of, right? So for example, if you're in the self-help area, maybe Brendan Burchard, right? Or somebody who's a big name. And then also think about some people who are a bit smaller names. And make that list of who are people who are who are competitors of yours, or they're doing the same thing. And then you can also look at who is a complementary practitioner. So Chris and I were recently in a mastermind with a woman called Geeta Nadkarni. Now, Geeta teaches people she's got a program called Baby Got Booked and a podcast of the same name. And so she teaches people how to get free PR. And she was a journalist. She is a journalist, actually. And so she writes for, I think, Forbes and a whole bunch of big name publications. And she's on CTV in Canada. And so, but she is funny. She is freaking quirky. She is zany. She's a riot. And so she's somebody who is not a direct competitor of mine, but she's a complementary practitioner, right? So she teaches people who want similar to what I teach. And she's got, I mean, I've got purple hair. It's a little faded right now, but for those of you seeing us, I'm a little bit quirky. I'm a little bit irreverent. I'm coming in here with, an AWeber shirt and not a suit. So she's somebody who I would want to know where's she been, because if a host liked her, there's a good chance they could like me, because they probably liked her energy. They probably liked what she was talking about, and so on. So you can search for also not just keywords, but you can search for the names of different people who are either influencers who are a few steps ahead of you, or people who are complementary. You may even want to search for people who are a few steps behind you. And when you can, and that'll just open up a whole rabbit hole. And when you find those shows, and you want to make sure when you find those shows, you listen to the show. You also want to make sure it is an interview show, that it's still producing episodes. When was the last one? And make sure that, again, you like the host, right?
Well, let's run through an example. MK serves relationship stuff for mature women about loving self first, and also dealing with aging issues. So if MK is looking for a podcast that she wants to potentially approach about being a guest on, like relationships for mature women, like how would you structure her search?
Well, I mean, I just get creative, right? So again, it's just like you would search for keywords for anything. So who is that mature woman? How old is she? What are her issues she's dealing with? Is she premenopausal? Is she postmenopausal? Is she perimenopausal? Is she, so relationships, is she single? Is she in a marriage? Is she dating? Is she widowed? So all those things. So know your ideal person, your student or your client. Know that person who you're working with and who you're serving, and then search for those. So for example, I'm single and over 40. I'm trying to think of any issues I might have.
Well, you mentioned, I think in another show, empty nest syndrome, right? Like
it's possible.
Kids leaving.
Yeah, it's possible. So like, what do I do when the kids leave home? Or what do I do? How do I find a hobby? Or, whatever you would Google, basically, you can Google those longer, questions. But in terms of shows, I mean, a few pop up in my mind I know of for mature adults doing different things. So like my friend Elaine Benoit, she's got a show called Maturepreneurial, and that is for folks over 40 who are starting their own business. So,
and I just want to highlight that point. Even though you may serve on the relationship front, that person who has the mature entrepreneur audience, even though that's not what that podcast is necessarily all about, those people are still going to have relationship stuff that they're curious about as well. So that's what you mean by it doesn't have to be an exact, I'm looking for only podcasts on relationships for mature women.
Yeah, exactly. It's about knowing who that client is. And then you're not searching for podcasts that serve mature women about relationships. You may find some in a larger niche. I mean, I'm sure there's ones about, self-love and being happy with who you are and all that stuff. But you think about your ideal person as a holistic being. And when you know what they need and what they love and what they want, you can find out, do I enjoy the same thing? So again, like Chris said, it's not necessarily direct, it's indirect. So maybe you you enjoy knitting, right? And so there are a lot of mature women who are knitting. And so maybe you can go on a show where you can talk about your hobby. Now, at the beginning of a podcast, generally, the host will open with your bio. Generally, I have definitely come across a number of shows that don't, that'll just turn it over to you and say, hey, who are you? That's okay too. Every once in a blue moon, I'll find a show that doesn't introduce you at all and does not give you the opportunity to position yourself. Those are not shows you want to be on. But if you essentially you're on a show that is pretty typical, the host is going to say, here is my guest today, XYZ. They're going to tell about you. You're preparing that bio generally and giving it to them. And then at the end, before you hang up, they'll say, how can people continue the conversation with you? Where can people find you online, or whatever they say? That those two places are opportunities for you to really shine in, this is who I serve and this is how I serve. Now, the whole meat is building a connection and a relationship with the audience and the host on something that they care about. So if you're a knitter and you're talking about knitting, and 5, 10, 15 minutes into it, the people who are listening are like, I really like this woman. And then at the end, you say, this is what I do. Many of those people could raise their hand and go, wait a minute, I need that too. And I like her because she's a knitter. I like her because we speak the same language. We get each other. I want to follow up with her. Maybe I didn't even know I had this problem, but I'm just so inspired by this person that I want to go follow up. And so then they can go and get your freebie and you can nurture that relationship. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. Well, we have, there's a bunch of niches here, but let's take Sean, who helps people learn how to become a professional cybersecurity professional, basically an ethical hacker. It's like a career. What would you advise Sean if he's, okay, this sounds great. I can find some podcasts that are at least tangentially related to the type of person that I serve. What are the next steps? What do I do now that I have my targets?
Yeah, definitely. So once you know, okay, here's some shows I would be interested in being on, I say ethically stalk them. So don't become a crazy person. Don't be a weirdo, but go on social media. Most podcasters are on Twitter. Not everybody, but most. That Twitter is a great way to connect with people. I love it for, shooting out tweets and saying, hey, I just caught this episode. Loved what you said about X. People want recognition. No matter how big they get, they really appreciate a heartfelt, sincere appreciation. You also want to make sure that when you're going through, if you say, okay, I want to be on this show, make sure you're leaving a 5-star rating and review. Because my angle is this: if you can't in good faith leave a 5-star rating and review on iTunes and publicly say, I value this show, then you shouldn't be on it. So leave a 5-star rating and review. Somebody like me who's got Android stuff, it definitely gets put on the to-do list to go back, because I can listen on the go, through another platform, but then I have to go back to iTunes and do that. So it does take time, but it's an important step. Podcast hosts don't always see that. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but again, you can even take a screenshot. Don't be weird about it, but you could share it with your audience. Like, I wouldn't send a screenshot of my iTunes review to the person and say, I reviewed your show. That's just weird. But you could take a screenshot and then, or a snip, and then you could post it on your Facebook or your LinkedIn or wherever's appropriate. Probably, Sean, for you, LinkedIn would be a great place to post it and say something like, make a short, mini blog on LinkedIn and say, I just listened to the show I was so inspired by, or, this person really, and I'm sorry, I'm not really familiar with your niche, but this person really nailed home this point that most people miss. thank you so much to tag the name of the guest and tag the name of the host for having a great show. And we like graphics, right? Social media is moving to video, is moving to graphics. So by having that graphic to go with that post, you're now showing your public appreciation. Your people are seeing that, and the host and the guest are seeing that. And so it's just a really nice thing to do when you're able to get on the radar of somebody by being of value in different ways. They'll remember you. So after you've gotten their attention, I have on my website, be a guest. It's right at the top, be a guest. So if anybody actually wants to be a guest on my show and they come to my website, they'll see it. But I get pitched all the time from people who've clearly never been on my website. So if someone though wants to bypass that and they've gotten my attention and they've provided value to me, and now we're on a kind of social, I know who they are. And if they were to say to me, hey, Nicole, I just wanted to check in if you're, okay, two things. So you could say, are you currently looking for guests? Open-ended question. Now the ball's in my court to say I am or I'm not. You're not telling me I want to be on your show. You're asking me, am I looking for guests? Then I'll respond. Or the other thing is they could say, hey, Nicole, I noticed your booking process on your site, and hopefully they've clicked it and they say, I've noticed this. Do you want me to, or not do you want me to, but I'd love to submit my video, because that's my booking process. I asked for a video. I'd love to submit my video. What's the best way to do it? On the website, or is there something better? Right. So now they're telling me like, hey, I'm applying. I respect your application process, but I want you to know about it so I don't slip through the cracks. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. And I just want to take a moment, if you could, and highlight your shows and your website. Like, what are your podcasts and your websites, Nicole?
Sure. So my interview-based show that you were just on yesterday is interviews is the Business Building Rockstar Show. So the bbrshow.com is the website. And on the front page right now, if you're watching live, you'll see Chris Badgett's interview. So that's that, bbrshow.com for the Business Building Rockstar Show. And then I've got Get Guest Ready, which is at interviews.convert.com/podcast. And that's all about podcast guesting, where I deep dive into what we're talking about here. And I give it to you in a more step-by-step organized fashion for like, here's the first thing to do, and here's an exercise, here's the second thing, and so on.
That's awesome. And I just want to highlight a point you mentioned about approaching people. As a software entrepreneur and a podcaster myself, sometimes in business, it can be uncomfortable if you're not used to it to ask for something, but it's really okay. And I just want to encourage people to do it. And I'll share one of my podcast guesting stories. I've, become comfortable with podcasting and being on camera and being interviewed and conducting interviews, but it wasn't always that way. But the only way to get better at it is just to do it. And for example, about a year ago, I was traveling, running the business from an RV, a travel trailer with my family. And I randomly came across a podcast called The RV Entrepreneur. I'm like, this is awesome. These are my people, because how many people are rolling around running like digital nomad tech companies from an RV? This is a tribe I'm a part of. So I immediately listened to 5 episodes, and then I shot the guy who hosted it an email. Was like, hey, this is me. This is what I'm up to. I'd love to be on your show. Here's some ideas I could talk about that I think might be great for your audience. And boom, I was on. And I'd say it happens maybe, once a month. I'll come across. I love finding a new podcast. And I was just recently on a guy named Joe Casabona, who has a podcast called How I Built It. And it interviews people who build premium WordPress plugins, which is exactly what I do. So I was like, hey, Joe, how's it going? I can't even remember how it all started. Some of it might have been social introduction from somebody else or whatever, but you just have to ask a lot of times, and just always have that in your mind of not just asking, but I'm going to ask, but I'm going to propose how I might be able to serve your audience.
Yeah. And you got to know those people before you asked anything. You listened and you got
Right.
a sense from them. And I think that's really key there. Because a lot of people miss that. It's you can ask somebody anything once you develop a rapport. But if you just go in there and ask and they don't know who you are, it's like just weird.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
not that they don't know who you are, but I mean, they don't know that you actually value them. Then it's just spam. But like when you're listening to a show and you're like, this is really cool, you're coming from a different place other than just, hey, you have a show and I want to be on it.
and here's another strategy. And we probably did this whenever I'm introduced to somebody, or I like to jump on before we do anything. I just like to jump on a 15 or 30-minute call and meet them. No strings attached. Like, let's see, let me understand, even though we've been introduced, or it seems like we might have some symmetry, or we might be able to service the same audience in some way. Just having that 15 or 30-minute call and seeing where it goes and getting to know how we might be able to collaborate just by talking about what we're up to and getting to know each other is a great, instead of asking for the slot or whatever, just asking for a call to chat. It's kind of like having a virtual coffee or whatever.
Yeah, I love that. And I actually specifically call it a virtual coffee because to me that's what it is. So it's like, hey, let's have a virtual coffee. And then people who are in the non-online space, they'll be like, what? And I'm like, well, we're in different places. So we have coffee, but on the computer.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, let's assume I've gotten a yes. And just to be clear, before we go into that, we're not talking about starting your own podcast here. We're talking about getting on other people's podcasts as a method of, it's a marketing method, it's a relationship building method, it's an audience building, it's a authority building activity. If using other people's audiences and becoming guests on their podcasts and adding value. So if I approach somebody, let's say there was another one here I wanted to highlight. Jeff, he does mental fitness training to help the jobless overcome discouragement that prolongs their unemployment. So let's say his course is, he's found somebody else who's serving kind of the underemployed or the unemployed, trying to make things right, and get back on the horse, or find a job if they've been having trouble finding employment. And let's say I found a podcast that's a perfect fit, and they said yes. What do I do? How do I can't believe it. They said yes. This podcast has like 100 iTunes reviews and has like a decent sized audience. I'm nervous. What should I talk about? Like, I have all these questions. Like, what should I do to really come on in style and take that stage in good form?
Great question. And chill out. And I
Yeah.
know that sounds like maybe crazy or simple or whatever, but you mentioned coffee, and that's actually how, and I apologize, I keep wiping my eye. I have something in my eye I can't figure out how to get out. Not my eyeball. It really is like a conversation. A podcast interview, while some interviews are going to be very structured and they will send you their formula and they'll tell you, here's my questions, like that's fine. But even if you have those questions, I encourage my clients to go through the questions so that they're aware, obviously listen to the show so you know what to expect. That's your best way to prepare. Just listening and getting a feel for the host and knowing what you truly and sincerely appreciate, and then being able just to talk about it. So when I first started, I would really have those lists in front of me of what they wanted me to say and, answers to questions. And it was so stiff. When you do that, when you read things off, when you script it out, you're missing the connection with the audience. You're missing the connection with the host. So imagine that you are at a cafe and it's busy and you've got a table and like it's beautiful weather right now where I'm at. So I like to imagine I'm sitting out on a patio somewhere and I'm with somebody I'm really enjoying. I'm really enjoying the conversation. I'm really into that person. They're just fascinating. And just imagine that. And that's what it is. It's like you're in the conversation and then you can imagine that people are hearing you. Imagine that people are leaning over because their conversation is so intense, it's so good. if you can imagine that when you go into a podcast interview, you'll be golden, because it really is a conversation between you and the host or hosts. Some shows have multiple hosts, some shows have like a panel, but it really is a conversation. You're not going in for a job interview. You're not going on television where you have to have talking points and you only get 3 minutes. Most podcasts, I actually was just on one that was 8 minutes. It was kind of weird. It was so like, but most podcasts, and you'll know what you want to look for, most podcasts are, 30 to 60 minutes, 20 to 40 minutes probably of actual conversation. So look for those and then go in there and think, I'm just going to talk. And again, you're at the beginning, here's what I do. At the end, here's what I do. In the middle, it's a conversation and it's enjoyable. And you know your topic. So for example, Jeff, like you get those feelings that people are going through when they're trying to get a job, and everything that they're finding, there's like a million people going for, and they're all kids, and maybe your client or your student is somebody who is, in their mid 30s and thought they were going to retire, and here they are now stuck without a job. And I don't know what your person is, but think about all those things, because you can talk about all those emotions, you can talk about all those feelings and experiences, and you can give lots of value and tips without it being blatantly, here, I have a program that's going to solve your problem. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. MK asks, how do I get experience? And I think you just got to do it. But what else would you say?
Yeah, just do it. I mean, you're not going to get experience by thinking about it. You just got to do it. So, and start small. Right. So there's a lot of, because hosts, we as hosts, I mean, we as course creators, we as anything, we as human beings, we start out not even being able to roll over or hold our heads up. Right. We're figuring it out as we go. And then as we mature, we can start rolling over on our belly, and then we can start crawling, and then we can start walking, and then we can talk. And, our sounds become words. And it's the same thing with anything you start. So when you're a podcaster, you start out just with the information and the education, but not the implementation. And so there's definitely a disconnect between what we see in our heads and what we imagine things are going to be like, and what actually happens when we start doing it. So if you can find places that podcasters are hanging out. I don't recommend that you go into Facebook groups for podcasters if you're not a podcaster, because you will not be in there very long, or you won't be respected, and then you're going to be not respected in front of hundreds of people. So you don't want to do that. But there's going to be different groups that you're part of on social media where people will be putting out there like, hey, I just started a podcast, I'm looking for guests. New podcasters always do that. So if you're a new podcast guest, it doesn't hurt to get your feet wet with some shows that maybe aren't ideal. Make sure though, because podcasts are evergreen. And so you want to make sure you're not going on a show that's totally a wrong fit. I did that at the beginning because I didn't know any better. So you don't want to go on a show that's a total wrong fit, and you don't want to go on a show that that the host just doesn't have, they're not professional. You want to look for new shows that are coming out from people who are professional in their business. So take a look at their website. Take a look at what they've done otherwise. Take a look at their social media profiles. Make sure that they've got their stuff together. And if they do, then go for it. Hop on, see if they'll interview you.
MK has another question about timing. So in the online course world, and this is something especially that our mutual friend Danny Inney teaches, he talks a lot about piloting a course where you test it very high touch with an early group of people. So MK is just getting started. She's in the beta course. It'll be over at the end of the summer. And so what, in terms of when to start?
Today.
Or that's what, even if it's a course that's going to be in the future, or any business that isn't officially on the market yet.
Yeah.
What do you say about timing?
So the great thing about podcast guesting is you're building your platform, you're building your authority, you're building relationships, you're getting your name out as somebody who's an expert. If you're an expert, then start now. If you're not an expert, then start now with something that you are an expert in and move over as you grow. This is something like, this is new media, right? People are not watching television as much as they used to, right? They're doing Netflix, they're doing on demand stuff. People are not listening to regular radio anymore. They're listening to satellite radio, they're listening to podcasts. So podcasting is growing and growing and growing, and it's only going to get bigger. So, there's some names probably that I don't know, I don't follow pop culture really, but I mean, maybe there's musicians that that are like a big deal, but I bet you that those musicians were out there hustling to get on radio, to get on TV, to get on late shows, to get on whatever, even before they hit it big. It's through that visibility that people hit it big, because you have to have an audience that loves you and that believes in you and likes your work before you'll hit it big. So in terms of in conjunction with your course, remember, you're not going on the show to promote your course. You're not going on podcasts to sell people something. You're going on podcasts to create relationships and to grow your authority and your influence and be seen as an expert. So you definitely want to get out there as soon as possible and just connect, bring value, and have a lead magnet in place. The top of your funnel has to be done. You don't have to have the bottom. And of course, there can always be a new bottom. You're always growing that funnel, but you want to start with, you have to have a way for them to opt in. Even if it's a Facebook group, even if it's a free Facebook group, you can do that. It's great to do it behind an opt-in page so that you can collect an email address, but it doesn't have to be. But you want to build your community, you want to build your audience so that you can then let them know, hey, the beta just wrapped up and here's the, experiences these people had. And if you'd like to jump in the next run, great. But those people are already in your community, not cold traffic. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. And I just want to do a quick education piece on the funnel concept if you're not familiar with it. If you have a course, or a course that's not even ready yet for the future, that's your product, that's the conversion point, that's the bottom of the funnel. But then we do all these activities to fill the funnel with leads, and a portion of those will convert or become a conversion into becoming a customer or a student. And at the top of the funnel, this is where you do things like, some people call them lead magnets or email opt-in bribes. It has lots of different names, but it's basically something for free that's of value that you give away in exchange for an email address. And this is just the concept of permission-based marketing. So if you're a course creator and you're going to start getting on some podcasts, it's nice at the end of the show, when the podcast host inevitably asks you, hey, where can people find out more about you? Or is there anything you're excited that you'd like to share with people? It's nice to point them to the top of your funnel, to a lead magnet. Even if your paid course isn't ready yet, you could put together some kind of ebook, checklist, what we call an email mini course, like a 3, 4, 10 email series that teaches something. So that's, in terms of timing, start as soon as possible building community. But like Nicole mentioned, you need to have a funnel, the top of the funnel at least, ready to capture those leads. Otherwise, you might be doing a little bit of general branding or name recognition or whatever, but you're really shooting yourself short if you're not getting people into your funnel. And my understanding, correct me if you would disagree, Nicole, but if you're a guest on somebody's podcast, at the end of that, of your main content where you're serving, and you have an opportunity to talk about what you're up to, or invite people to come join your tribe, it's best to point people towards a free resource or a lead magnet and not go straight for the sale, like, buy my course, here it is. Would you agree, or how?
Oh, of course. Of course. And, Sean mentions that he's got a couple of different lead magnets, and so do I. That's great. You can have lots of them. You want to make it relevant. You invite people to take a next step with you that's relevant. And a lot of times I'll just say, like, I won't even have in mind what I'm going to give away at the beginning of the episode or of the interview, because I want to keep it really organic, especially if I'm on a show that's not directly speaking about and to my target audience. I'll just let them know at the end. I'll say, you know what, I'm going to put together a page and give you some resources on some of the things we talked about today. And then I'll have links to like a couple blog posts or a video or whatever. And I just make that page up after the interview. Keep in mind that this is a long process. It is very rare that you're going to say, okay, I found a show I want to be on. Okay, I'm going to reach out. Okay, the host says yes. Then I get on and then it goes to air. That does not normally happen quickly. So I may do an interview, like I just did an interview right before I hopped onto this, and I think it's going live like mid-July. So a lot of hosts, especially for bigger shows, are booking a couple months out, right? Like Chris, you interviewed me already a while ago. I don't even know when that's going out.
It's probably another 6 weeks or 5 weeks.
And Chris got on my show really fast simply because I had an opening. I had something change around, but that's so rare when you're on an established show. When you're on a brand new show, it may happen sooner. But here's the thing too, if you're on a brand new show, and this is why another reason it's important to make sure they're a professional, most brand new shows don't actually make it. So they will go out there and record maybe 20 interviews, and sometimes they never even start their show. Or maybe they'll go to like episode 5 or 10, and then it's just, they're like, oh, other things come up. So a lot of interviews that you do, if you're going on brand new shows, will probably not see, I would say there's a good chance it's like a toss up 50-50. If you're doing new podcasts, there's a good chance that that's just practice and that they're never going to see the light of day. If you're going on ones who are established and, they're in it and they're professional, then you may I don't even know if I've ever, I've done over 100 interviews, and I don't think I've ever had it go out, like maybe once, maybe because it was a situation like mine where it was like, hey, something happened. Can you do this really quickly? But other than that, it's at least weeks, if not months, before your episode will generally air. So that said, maybe you're in a program now and it's going to be a completely different program that you're promoting, or a book or something else when that goes live. So you want to make sure that you're giving them a way to come into your community, nurture them, so that whenever it is, it's what you call evergreen, right? So that top piece is that value that you can capture leads with, and that you can give them value, and that you can keep that conversation going with the listener who likes you. Every once in a while, you'll have something, really every once in a while. This isn't very common, but I was on a show where the woman, like, she literally wrote me immediately after the show aired, and she was like, I cannot believe this. I was talking about lead magnets or something. And she's like, I've never heard anyone describe it like this. This was so great. I need your help. I need to work with you. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. But I think that's happened like once. I've had similar things, but not that blatant. So you're going in there, you're speaking to hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people. And imagine being on a stage, you have a couple minutes, you get to let people know you exist, and then you want to be able to connect with them directly.
That's awesome. And the evergreen nature is no joke. Like, if I discover a new podcast that I really like, I'm going to go back. I don't care if it's years in the past, and listen to that stuff. So it's just really important to think about the long-term value of that. And also, just a kind of a pro tip, Sean was asking about lead magnets, like your mini course. Your free mini course, you can even, like, if you're going on a pretty established podcast, or really any podcast, but if you really want to give it that extra touch, what you can do is you can create a custom landing page to send that traffic to, and say, you could even have like a personalized video, like, hey, I see you're coming from blah, blah, blah podcast or community. You're going to love this checklist. It's going to help you in exactly this way. And you can really speak to that.
I don't see any podcasts matching a sale.
my Siri is talking to me. I must have said something. But anyway, so that custom landing page trick, and I know that's something that I've seen you do, Nicole, which is like really amazing and like really professional. But that's something to just kind of add that personal touch to it.
Yeah, and another thing is you can make that into an affiliate linked page, right? If the person is somebody you want to have a long-term relationship with, and if it's somebody that I mean, it takes minutes, right? And the thing is it takes minutes, and this is why most people don't do this stuff, is because it's like, oh, it's too much extra work, I don't have time. Like, that's why you need to create a system. And get guest ready, we talked about that a few times, but that's where I'm breaking down, like, here's how to do it. And I'm gonna blatantly promote myself right now, because this is one of the biggest problems that people have. They're not seeing revenue, they're not seeing success with podcast guesting, because they don't have the systems in place, or they don't have the time to put it in place, or they have team members who may be great team members, but they don't understand the intricacies and the little things that are going to make it different for a podcast, host, and just to move the needle forward. And so that's what I do. I have done for you services, I've done with you services, I have free stuff, but that's really what I specialize in. And so if anybody is thinking, I want to find out more, or, okay, I want to do this, but I don't want to do it myself, I want your help, definitely reach out to me. I have a link I can give people if they want to apply for consultation. I'm really, really busy right now. I have a pretty full roster of clients, but I definitely am also always looking for new clients who are going to be rock stars, and who I'm going to be able to help just go from where they are to like where they want to be in no time flat. So
that's awesome. Well, let's do a little bit of a kind of do's and don'ts round. Like, you've seen, if you're going to be a podcast guest, what are some big no-nos or things that happen that are kind of unfortunate that ruffle the feathers of some hosts? And then how do you be a guest and really just style it? Like, what are some quick tips, do's and don'ts?
So just remember, every host is different, right? So what ruffles some people's feathers wouldn't ruffle others, and what ruffles, everybody's so different. You're dealing with people, and you're dealing with people who are creating something just like you are. And so just like you wouldn't want somebody to come in and tell you, oh, well, your course could be better if, or, if you're a parent, you don't want somebody coming in and telling you, well, you shouldn't be doing this or saying that. You don't want to go into a podcast and be like, well, you need to do it my way. That is a big pet peeve. Like, if you do that, it's pretty much across the board. A host will not appreciate you. You want to treat the host the way you want to be treated. So try and put yourself into their shoes. Recognize that a podcast is a labor of love, and there's a lot of things that they probably could do better, but they're human, and there's only so much time in the day, and you don't know what their strategy or their plan is. So just be mindful of that. Don't go in with your own agenda. That's a big one I hear a lot, where podcasters will talk about, like, I asked this guest this thing, and every time I asked, no matter what I asked, they always came back to this point, and it's really frustrating. So if you're going in with your own agenda of what you want to talk about, that's really uncool. You can definitely, when you're booking or before, you're having a little chit chat, you can say, hey, I'm promoting my book right now, or I'm promoting my course right now, or I'm doing this right now. I'd love it if we could touch on that, if that's all right. Just come from a place of, if you don't mind, this is what I'd really like to do. A lot of hosts actually in their vetting or their booking process will ask you, is there something you're currently promoting? What is it that you want to talk about? Do you have talking points? So every host is different. I think the big thing, though, is letting them drive the bus. Once you're there, let them drive the bus and go along for the ride. Make sure you have water with you. So I've got my mason jar, and I got these nifty sippy lids, and people might go, I'm not using that because that's for kids. Listen, this is computer stuff right here. If I spill this because I bumped something, I want to make sure I don't have a catastrophe. So this is why I use sippy lids. But have water, tissues, you know, pen and paper. You don't want to be typing when you're doing an interview because it'll pick up the sound. You can mute yourself when you're not talking. It depends on the platform. It depends on your microphone. But if you mute yourself when you're not talking, it will be less of a distraction if something happens for the host. And it'll just be a better sound quality too. Make sure, speaking of sound quality, you have appropriate equipment. And I'm guessing that Chris probably covers this because if you're a course creator, you should be recording on equipment that makes you like look and sound like a professional. So you can get a headset that's called a Logitech ClearChat headset. It's about 25, 30 bucks in the States. You can get it from Amazon. And then I have what's called, and I think, do you have, no, you have a better one, I think, right? I have a ATR 2100.
That's the same thing I have.
Okay, so it's about 60, 70 bucks and it gives good sound quality. I've also got a Yeti, and so there's all different kinds, but basically if you want to have an external microphone and you use earbuds or a headset with it so you don't get background, you're looking at, 70 bucks, let's say. If you're wanting something more budget friendly or something that can travel really easily, the Logitech ClearChat is less. And you want to make sure that a big pet peeve is when people don't share. So if a host like puts your show up, you should be sharing it anyhow, right? But if a host is like on Twitter or something and they're tagging you, or on Facebook or whatever, I don't share so much on Facebook because I just use it differently. But if somebody posts about, my podcast interview, right? They're promoting me. The very least I can do is like it and share it, retweet it. That's really easy. And most people don't do that. So make sure you're like acknowledging and appreciating the host after the interview as well. If you have an e-zine or something that you mail out and you want to let your audience know that you were on a show, that's great. Just again, that goes back though to, I think, treating people the way you want to be treated, right?
That's awesome. Well, I'm gonna get into a question we have here. If anybody else has any questions, please use the Q&A feature. And also, if you'd like to come live and have a back and forth conversation around the podcast guesting opportunity for growing your student base, we'd be glad to do that and answer some questions live. But Ivan asks, it seems obvious, but when do you recommend to start with the learning platform, Lifter LMS? Some people suggest to start with the courses by email, and after this, get experience, and to have videos, start with the learning platform. What do you think? So I think this kind of ties into Nicole's point about when should you start podcasting, and the answer is, or start getting exposure and getting on other podcasts. She was saying like right away. And the reason I say that is because a lot of people do it backwards. They launch their course, they look for technology, and then they build their course, the content, and then they go try and build community. That's the hardest uphill way to do it. If you do it the other way around and you start with a community building, obviously you've got some expertise in your field, but you're building community, you're becoming a guest on other people's podcasts, you're building your own private community by having a lead magnet in place to start building your email list. From there, that little lead magnet, like you mentioned, Ivan, an email-based course, like if you're a new course creator, yeah, start with that. Just start podcast guesting, have a free email mini course, be your lead magnet, see how the people respond to it, see what kind of results they're getting, get on the phone with some of those people so you can actually have a conversation with them and see how helpful your content was and what questions they have or where they're stuck. And over time, from that interaction, you can develop a full-on course, including videos or even webinars like we're doing right now. And then the technology should really be the last thing you look for. Once you have that learning experience designed and it's working and you've got community, then you can wrap it in the tools and the technology. But unfortunately, I've just seen a lot of people go to the technology first And it creates a lot of frustration because that community building and the course design hasn't happened yet. So you kind of get things out of order sometimes. That's just my opinion and how I see it.
I did
But
that. When I started, that's what I did. I did it totally backwards and it was hard. And then once I had the course and everything was great, I couldn't sell it. So had to switch things up.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've all been there. I've been there too. I've done it that way too. So I'm not preaching to something I haven't done before. Cool. And Ivan said he has done it that way as well. So yeah, there's no time like the present or in the early stages of a project to start working on building that community, building that email list. And don't focus on like tactics to build the email list. Focus on service and serving other audiences. And that's what it's all about. I always call it like the triple win, or even the quadruple win if you're a course creator. So you're the education entrepreneur, so you have to win. The podcast host has to win. The podcast host guests have to win. And ultimately, when you have your course, your students have to win. So as long as I think that's all like a little confusing and too much going on, just focus on the podcast guests and then your students. As long as those two groups are winning, everything else is going to fall into place, and that's where value comes from. Well, if anybody else has any final questions, go ahead and ask them in the Q&A. And if anybody wants to come live here, feel free to raise your hand. I'm just looking in the viewers there. If anybody wants to talk about anything live, raise your hand. But if we're going to get any final questions, go ahead and do that. But while we're waiting, Nicole, if people are like digging this and they want to learn more from you about like how to go about all this, or maybe even they want some help, where should they go on your stuff? How can they connect with you, and how can they find out more about podcast guesting?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. And yeah, if anybody has any questions or wants to jump on, I'd love to do that as well. But if they just want to kind of follow up after we're done, get guest ready. The podcast is a great place to go. There's no opt-in required. You can just start listening. From there, if you're listening to the show and you see like, oh, wow, I want more, I tell you about Get Guest Ready. It's a free e-course. Right now it's free. Inside of that. So if you listen to Get Guest Ready, I'll tell you where you can get more support with that. If you're like, you know what, I just know I want to work with you, I know I want your support, then you can go to interviews.convert.com/apply. And there's an application form there where you can put in your information, and then we can schedule a time for us to talk and see how I can support you.
That's awesome. Well, I don't think we've got any more questions at this point. I want to thank you for coming on the webinar, Nicole. Thank you for your time. And for all of you listening out there, if I was going to pick one strategy that was super high leverage, I'm launching a new course and I don't have community yet, or I'm in the process of building that course, I would do podcast guesting and leverage other people's audience and serve other people's audience and build great relationships with other hosts. And I have a few more things to say, but before I do that, Nicole, there's some people in the chat asking for the link if you have a link there. And we're also going to be sending this out as a replay. So there'll be I'll be sure to include that in the email that goes out with the replay link. And Ivan saying, thank you, great material. Well, thank you very much for coming, Ivan. But the last thing I wanted to say, like sales and marketing isn't that crazy. I like to boil it down to 3 activities, what I call inbound, outbound, and relationships. Inbound means content marketing. Outbound is like prospecting, that's cold email, cold calling, like cold approaching people. And then relationships is just what it sounds like. You build relationships, you see where it goes. And, you know, a lot of great things come from relationships. Not all relationships, I mean, there's business relationships. A lot of those also become friendships, but relationships is a great way of marketing. The thing with podcast guesting is it's all 3 of those combined in one. You're creating great content inbound. you're doing prospecting, you're doing outbound where you're reaching out into other people's audiences. You're cold approaching hosts who haven't heard of you before, and you're trying to figure out how you can add value to them and serve their community while also potentially getting traffic back. And you're also building a relationship at scale, not just with the host, but also with their community, which is very powerful. And then with the evergreen nature of podcasts and the barrier to entry, and that it's kind of difficult, it's not crazy, but it's kind of hard to start a podcast. It's more difficult than starting a blog. And the staying power, like Nicole mentioned, the people that are still around after 50 or 100 episodes, it's just harder to pull off. So when you do that well and you get exposure on some platforms, it can go a long ways. And I would also just kind of as a final thought, just encourage people to not get starstruck and realize that, there may be like this famous A-list podcaster that you listen to who has like, 1 million downloads, and they're always talking about how many downloads they get a month for their podcast or whatever. But I would much rather be on a podcast that has like 500 people that listen to it, that is extremely targeted, than necessarily go after the big number shows. I mean, if the big number shows had my audience and they said yes, that'd be great too. But there's a lot of small to medium-sized podcasts that may actually be an even better fit. So do you have any final parting thoughts, Nicole?
No, I totally agree with all of that. In fact, I was just on a podcast just before this, and we were talking about this topic, and my conversion, like for some of the really big shows that I've been on, like I've had very, very few opt-ins, whereas I had 88% opt-in for a smaller thing that I did, where there were maybe a couple thousand people. That was for Summit, but also for podcasts that are more around like 1 to 200 downloads per episode. When I'm really narrowing it down and I'm getting on shows that, here's the thing, like a lot of the bigger shows also produce a lot of content. So people tune in, not necessarily for the guests, but they're tuning in because of the host. So the guest is great, but they're not taking action necessarily. Whereas some of the smaller shows are really looking to promote and support their guests. Those are the ones that I get a lot of leverage from.
That's awesome. Well, Nicole, I want to honor you and thank you for doing what you do. Thank you for coming on this webinar with the Lift Your LMS crew. And for everybody listening, I'd encourage you to check out interviewsthatconvert.com and go see more of the magic that Nicole has going on over there. And I hope everybody has an awesome rest of your day.